Maggie and Claire, you guys are so organized and so fluent. And you're both at land-grant institutions, and I'm kind of the ringer on this panel because I'm not at a land-grant institution. In fact, I think if you ask the average person at Indiana University what our role is in feeding the world, the answer you would hear is, that's not our job. We think about feeding the world, but we don't actually feed anybody. So I think I'll take this role as the ringer and run with it a little bit. And I want to start by relating something that I learned in an unexpected place. I thought I knew something about the role of the university in feeding the world. Although I'm now at a non-land grant institution, Indiana University, I have worked at land grant colleges. I've spent several years at New Mexico State. I was out of academia and I worked as a consumer of agricultural knowledge for the U.S. Agency for International Development. I spent several years doing applied research with the Energy and Resources Group at Berkeley. So I always chafe at this kind of non-applied side of my own university. Nevertheless, it wasn't until last year that I really thought more about the general relationship of all universities to rural life. And this was while I was setting up a farm internship program for our liberal arts students to go and spend 6 to 8 weeks during the summer working on a real farm in Indiana. And the farmer I've been working with, Adam Moody, is a fourth-generation farmer. His farm is near Greencastle, which is where DePaul is. It's about 120 miles north of Bloomington. He runs a kind of pastured chicken and hog operation, and he's got 3 meat stores scattered around Indianapolis, where some of his family do the butchering. And he related to me how, since he's started to change his pasturing methods and change his orientation in his agriculture, he's gotten a lot of opposition and a lot of kind of nasty comments from people in his town who don't really have a lot of tolerance for people who are not doing corn and soybeans rotations. And it's not like Adam is a kind of strange person. He's a fundamentalist Christian, and he's a fourth-generation farmer, and his family's been there for a long time. And I asked him, so why do you think people are so opposed? And he said, well, think about it. Take a rural town, and every year take the brightest kids from high school and ship them off, never to return again. And he said, do that for 4 generations and look at who's left. And suddenly I started to realize that one of the historical roles of the university has been to get people off the farm. Whatever we say, there's a kind of implicit agenda that as agriculture develops, we're going to rationalize the countryside. The surplus workers are going to go to the city. Remember, when the land-grant colleges were founded, way more than 70% of the U.S. population was on the farm. And today, after all these years of agricultural education, it's down to about 2%. So we're doing a pretty good job of sucking people out of the countryside and spewing them into the city. And in fact, when I worked for U.S. Aid, I worked on a scholarship program where we collected the brightest young farmers from all over the country of Belize, and we sent them off to schools in the U.S. for 1-, 2-, and 3-year training. And when we came back, every single one of them got an office job. And we weren't really developing agriculture. We were developing an agricultural bureaucracy, and we were helping the Ministry of Agriculture staff itself with people educated in agriculture, but we sure weren't helping agriculture. We were taking the best farmers and taking them out of agriculture. And I think the whole notion that the land-grant colleges are founded on, which is economies of scale, improved technology, and more efficiency so that you can cut down the amount of labor per acre. If you look at what the effects of that technology is, it's to remove people from the land. And unfortunately, it's hard to get across to a lot of development economic types that our problem in a place like Belize is not getting more people off the land and getting them to move to the city, because there are no jobs for them in the city. And if we get them off the farm, they're just going to go to the United States and get jobs and join the ranks of our illegal aliens. As most of the people that used to farm in most of the villages where I've worked, well, most of them are in Chicago now, taking care of our elderly. So getting prices really low and squeezing the maximum amount per hour of labor is a very good program for getting people off the land. And I think that we have to kind of own up to the fact that the university plays a central role in doing that. Now, second, I want to talk about Cartesian dualism, because the state of Indiana, where I live, has a university which could have been designed by the hand of Descartes. The head is in Bloomington, and the hands are at Purdue. And the people at Purdue are supposed to do practical things with their hands, and they're supposed to be concerned about the real world, and their buildings are built out of cinder block, and they have linoleum on the floor. And in Bloomington, we're supposed to be thinking high thoughts, and we're supposed to be artistic, and we're supposed to be doing abstract kinds of science, and developing pure knowledge, and not getting our hands dirty if we don't even have hands. And there's this kind of politics of knowledge that, and of course our buildings are made out of limestone, and we have wood paneling and wood floors. So we have a lot of cultural capital, and we don't get paid as much as they get paid at Purdue. They have more economic capital, to use Bourdieu's terminology. And then we reproduce those same divisions in the university, where the practical schools get the crummy buildings and have low status, so the School of Health, Physical Education, and Recreation is kind of stuck around the pool in a bunch of overheated rooms. And the math department, where they think a lot of high thoughts, has walnut paneling and coffered ceilings and oil paintings of famous mathematicians. So here we are at Indiana University trying to put together a food studies program. Oh, I should mention, in Indiana there was a serious problem with the medical school. Because, yeah, medicine is done with the hands, but you sure do want a head attached to those hands before you're going to let them take your body apart. But they couldn't decide where to put the medical school, whether it was head or hand, so they put it halfway in between in Indianapolis. And that's where they put the law school, too, because, you know, who knows what lawyers are. Definitely doing something practical, but they're doing it with their mouths, so they've got to be in Indianapolis. The vet school, Purdue could have the vet school, but and even at IU, the School of Optometry isn't on campus. It's kind of across a busy intersection where people get run over trying to walk between the two parts of campus.
Especially if they don't have good eyes.
So there are some, so here at IU we have a food studies program. At Purdue they have the Center for Ingestive Science. And we both claim to be multidisciplinary. I've actually been invited to the ingestion place to give a talk next year. But it is pretty much dominated by people who work in food science and whose goal is to get people to eat more of something and not necessarily to think about why. Whereas we don't really have very many people interested in getting anybody to do anything, but we ask why every single day. And I think in some ways it's a kind of a blessing that we are far from the agro-industrial complex and we have no funding. Because we're not really beholden to anybody, and we have political scientists, people in media and communications, English, anthropology, history, geography, folklore, ethics, the School of Public and Environmental Affairs, biology, nutrition, and human biology. And there is a little garden on campus. So we can actually go up there and see plants now and then and pick some food. But it's a very different approach to thinking about food and feeding the world from the kind of approach we would have if we were at a land-grant school. And sometimes I wish that Purdue was not so far away. But on the other hand, we can choose who we want to come and talk to us. And this is probably reflected in our choice of speakers. In the last year, we've had Michael Pollan, Wes Jackson, Wendell Berry, Gary Naban, and Joel Salatin, which is not exactly a balanced roster in any representative from Cargill or Monsanto.
They wouldn't come speak anyways.
Yeah, they might, but you know, maybe if we said, it may be that they think we were so ignorant that we'd be safe. They'd be safe. Okay, the third topic I want to take up is what I saw happening in when I worked for USAID back in the early '80s. In the '70s, there was a burst in the development business of what was called basic needs. There was a lot of interest in helping people feed themselves. And there was a lot of investment by the United States through USAID and other organizations in developing agricultural research institutes and experimental farms in developing countries. And in training people to teach in those places and in basically giving them the capacity to do their own research and their own development and to develop their own extension systems. And there was some recognition that all those extension systems didn't have to be cookie cutters of the American extension system. Then Ronald Reagan was elected. And I was working for USAID at the time that Ronald Reagan was elected. And within 3 months, we had a directive from the main office in Washington that we were no longer to work with these local institutions in developing projects. So USAID had been funding CARDI, the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute, for 20 years. And we had a CARDI extension farm in Belize, where I was working, that was developing crops for Belize and experimenting with crops that small farmers might be able to use. We had funded the Belize School of Agriculture, where I had lectured, and we had trained some of their staff, and we had very good relations with them, with the whole idea that we would be able to work with these local institutions to develop agricultural development projects. And overnight, we were told that we had to work with the private sector. Government was bad, and government institutions were bad, and we could no longer work with them. So we had invested this enormous amount of money and resources in training these people, Then we cut the funding off, and we were supposed to find a local private organization or company to partner with to run an agricultural development project. And there weren't any. So we got a retired Ministry of Agriculture official, and we paid him to start a private company. And then we gave him the contract to do the agricultural development project. And he hired a bunch of out-of-work extensionists who had been laid off by the government when we had been supporting the Ministry of Agriculture to do agricultural development. And then the next year, to run a cacao development project, we partnered with Hershey, which made a promise as part of the contract, they made a promise of a minimum support price for organic cacao from Belizean farmers, which they never honored. After they were paid, they never honored the contract, and actually they stopped buying cacao in Belize shortly after, within a week after the contract was up. Then we were told that we had to partner with Birdseye to help them develop a small frozen vegetable export business, and that's the point where I and USAID parted company. None of those projects worked. They all pumped money into the private sector. I guess they worked from that perspective. But we had basically had to set up a fake private sector in order to do these projects. And what I've seen since then is a series of flip-flops where the development business goes through these kind of annual cycles of fashion, where, you know, this year it's small livestock, and next year it's microcredit, and you know, a year later it's let's export beef, and there is no longer any local institutional capacity to kind of look at these things critically. And this has been reproduced over and over and over again in many different parts of the world. I will just speak very, very briefly on my fourth point, and that is what I call topical butchery. And that is that if you look around the university, any university, and you ask who's responsible for food, it's like going to the federal government and saying who's responsible for food. Because there's 1,000 agencies responsible for food or have something to do with food. We don't study food. We divide the study of food up into as many pieces as we divide an animal up into before it goes to the supermarket. And we hand them off to specialists, each of whom becomes extremely good, and you know the saying, knowing more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. And it's a parody because we never really get to that point of knowing everything about nothing, but we, in the process, have developed an approach to food that is so fragmented across disciplines and across so many different paradigms of human nature and ways of thinking about issues like choice and ways of thinking about the difference between individuals and social units, that when we get together to talk about food, we can have a common conversation as long as we stick to the food. But as soon as we start talking about humans, it turns out that the economist thinks that humans are individuals acting as rational actors, and the sociologist thinks that they belong to groups. And they act as, they act in the interest of groups, and the anthropologist believes in all of them at the same time. We actually reproduce these same divisions within my own discipline. So we have economic anthropologists, and we have ecological anthropologists, and then we have the biological anthropologists, and the nutritional anthropologists. And we have exactly the same kinds of problems talking to each other. Which usually makes anthropology departments very fractious places. The one thing that has held my department together through some very difficult discussions and times has been the recognition that we are all interested in food. and that we can all relate what we do to food, and we try to keep our eyes focused on the food and not on the differences in our different paradigms. And I'm frustrated with disciplinarity. The disciplines were created in a different world. They were created in 19th century Germany. And the way that 19th century Germans divided the world up is not really functional in the 21st century. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. And you know, I've got colleagues in geography who are doing exactly the same thing I'm doing, but they're referring to a completely different literature, which says almost exactly the same thing that our literature says.
I know.
And we even refer to some of the same French people. So we can even agree on what French people we want to cite, but we live in kind of two separate worlds. So I'll leave it at that since we've gone over time.